In 1927, there was this doctor who actually won the Nobel Prize in medicine for a treatment plan that, if you look at it today, it sounds like absolute madness.
Oh, completely. It sounds like malpractice.
Right. Because he was intentionally, deliberately infecting his own patients with malaria.
Yeah.
And he wasn't, trying to study the malaria parasite itself, and it wasn't some kind of lab mistake. He was purposefully trying to induce this nearly fatal, like, bone-rattling fever in his patients.
Which is just wild to think about now.
It is. But today, we are actually going to explain exactly why that terrifying biological gamble is, it's the exact same logic you need to apply to your retirement account.
Yeah, in your career, your daily life.
Exactly.
It is genuinely one of the most counterintuitive overlaps between human biology and behavioral finance that you will ever come across.
So, welcome to the deep dive. If you are, the learner, whether you're listening to this on your morning commute, maybe prepping for a massive strategy meeting, or you're just trying to catch up on behavioral economics.
Or if you're just insanely curious about how the human brain actually operates in the real world, right?
Yeah.
When the pressure's really on.
Yeah, then you are in the exact right place. Because we're sitting right across the table from you today, and we are going to unpack something that completely flips the script on how we're all taught to make decisions.
We really are. We're working from a totally fascinating source document today. It's this excerpt titled 10 reasonable rational.pdf.
The greater than symbol, right?
Right. Reasonable is greater than rational, and the entire mission of this deep dive is literally right there in that mathematical symbol. The author is basically arguing that aiming to be mostly reasonable works significantly better.
And is far more survivable.
Yes, far more survivable in the long run than trying to be coldly, perfectly rational.
I love that. And the quote that kind of sets the hook for this entire exploration is just beautifully blunt. The author writes, and I'm quoting here, "You're not a spreadsheet. You're a person, a screwed up, emotional person."
Which is so refreshing to hear.
It really is, because usually, when we talk about financial planning or career optimization or even like diet and exercise programs, we get handed these flawless, mathematically perfect spreadsheets.
Oh yeah, the classic 10-step optimal plan.
Right. And we're just told, hey, just follow the math.
And the cultural assumption there is that emotion is a bug in the system.
Like a glitch.
Exactly. It's viewed as a weakness that needs to be just completely eradicated through sheer discipline.
But our mission today is to kind of tear that assumption down, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're going to explore exactly why optimizing your life like a cold, calculating machine usually backfires spectacularly.
Spectacularly.
And we're going to look at why accepting our flawed, emotional, and frankly, highly social nature isn't a failure of discipline at all.
So what is it?
It is actually the ultimate cheat code for long-term endurance.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why pure rationality fails us in a spreadsheet, the source material argues we first have to look at how it fails us in our own biology.
Right. Which brings us back to the malaria.
Yes. To do that, we have to travel back to that wild medical story I mentioned at the top of the show. We are talking about Julius Wagner-Jauregg.
The 19th-century Austrian psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And we really have to set the stage for what he was dealing with here, because the stakes, they literally could not have been higher.
It was life or death.
Entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Wagner-Jauregg specialized in treating patients with severe neurosyphilis. And in the late 19th and early 20th century...
This is pre-penicillin.
Exactly. Way before the discovery of penicillin.
Yeah.
Syphilis wasn't just an infection you get a shot for. It was a slow, agonizing death sentence.
Right, because it eventually it attacks the nervous system and the brain. It leads to something they called general paresis of the insane.
Yeah, which is an incredibly dark term.
It sounds horrific. You had asylums literally filled with people suffering from severe delusions, paralysis, dementia, and it was entirely driven by this late-stage infection.
Right. It was a completely hopeless scenario. The medical community had absolutely nothing to offer these patients. They were just waiting to die.
But Wagner-Jauregg, he had a unique skill set, didn't he?
He did. He was an incredibly astute observer of patterns.
Okay.
And he started noticing this bizarre, highly specific anomaly among his neurosyphilis patients. He observed that occasionally a patient would miraculously recover their cognitive faculties and actually survive the syphilis.
Wait, naturally, just out of nowhere?
Well, not out of nowhere. That's the anomaly. They only recovered if they had the added terrible misfortune of contracting a completely unrelated illness.
Oh, wow.
But not just any illness. It had to be something that triggered a prolonged, intense fever.
Okay, so he recognized that the fever wasn't just like a symptom of a new disease. It was actually acting as a mechanism of cure for the old one.
Yes, exactly. Now, the idea that fevers could be healing wasn't entirely new, to be fair.
Right.
The source notes that the ancient Romans literally worshipped a goddess of fever,
Febres, I think.
Febres, believing she could burn away sickness. But Wagner-Jauregg didn't just, write a speculative paper about this historical hunch.
No, he took action.
He jumped to a conclusion that was mathematically logical,
Right.
but practically speaking, absolutely terrifying. He decided that if a severe fever could cure a fatal brain infection, he needed to manufacture severe fever.
He became like a biological arsonist.
That's a great way to put it.
So in the early 1900s, this doctor begins intentionally injecting his fatal neurosyphilis patients with low-end strains of infectious diseases.
Yeah.
And he didn't even start with malaria, right? Didn't he start with typhoid?
He started with typhoid. Then he actually moved to smallpox.
Oh my God. Smallpox.
I know. He was purposefully trying to trigger fevers strong enough to literally coax the syphilis out of their brains.
It sounds like absolute madness.
Yeah.
I mean, you have a patient dying of one horrific disease, and your brilliant treatment plan is to infect them with typhoid.
It's totally counterintuitive, and the source explicitly notes that this was as incredibly dangerous as it sounds. Some of his early patients actually died from the experimental treatments themselves.
Because you're giving a dying person smallpox.
Right.
But he doesn't stop. He keeps going.
He keeps going. He eventually refines the process and settles on a very specific tool, which was a relatively weak version of malaria.
Okay, why malaria specifically?
Because it causes absolutely devastating, bone-rattling, high-temperature fevers. But crucially...
There's a cure.
Exactly. After a few days of letting the patient essentially burn, Wagner-Jauregg could step in and effectively counter the malaria with quinine.
Right, so he was using one disease as, like, a thermal weapon against another, and then relying on quinine as the fire extinguisher before the house completely burned down.
That's exactly it.
Okay.
And here is where the story shifts from a macabre medical experiment to literal medical history. Because after years of this incredibly risky trial and error, the data he reported was undeniable.
What were the numbers?
6 in 10 syphilis patients treated with this malaria therapy recovered.
6 in 10. That is a 60% survival rate for a disease that was previously considered 100% fatal.
Yeah, and compared to only about 3 in 10 who were left alone and naturally experienced some sort of spontaneous remission, he literally doubled their chances of survival by giving them malaria.
That is staggering.
And the medical community, seeing this empirical evidence, they recognized the sheer genius of his pattern recognition. So in 1927, Julius Wagner-Jauregg won the Nobel Prize in medicine.
Wow.
Yeah. The Nobel Organization's official records still note today that his life's main work was the endeavor to cure mental disease by inducing fever.
Now, obviously, we probably need to clarify for anyone listening that penicillin came along a couple of decades later and made malaria therapy completely obsolete.
Oh, absolutely. Please do not give people malaria today.
Right, we do not need to give people malaria anymore to cure infections. But the source points out that he remains one of the only doctors in history who not only recognized that fever fights infection, but actively, aggressively prescribed it as a treatment.
And this brings us to the modern science backing up his 19th century hunch, which the source document outlines beautifully, by the way.
Yeah, let's get into the science of it.
We now have concrete, irrefutable scientific evidence that fevers are not accidental nuisances. They are not a glitch in your biology. They are a highly sophisticated, deeply evolved defense mechanism.
Okay, so how exactly does it work? Because I think most people, myself included, just view a fever as the body overheating. You know, like a car radiator breaking down on the highway.
Right, that's the common perception, but it's actually the exact opposite. Your body isn't breaking down at all. It is deliberately turning up the thermostat in your hypothalamus.
Okay.
The text actually cites an NIH paper explaining the mechanics of this.
Yeah.
Many viruses and bacteria are highly, highly temperature sensitive.
Because they evolved to survive at our normal body temp.
Exactly. They evolved to thrive perfectly at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So when your body raises its temperature by even a single degree, it fundamentally alters the environment for them. It actually denatures the proteins of the virus.
Wow.
The NIH study shows that just a 1 degree increase in body temperature can slow the replication rate of some viruses by a factor of 200.
Wait, a factor of 200, just from one single degree.
Yes.
It's like trying to run a marathon underwater for the virus.
That's a perfect analogy. It makes the host environment incredibly hostile for the invader. And at the exact same time, it is simultaneously hyperactivating your own immune cells.
Like white blood cells.
Right, like macrophages and T cells.
Mm.
The heat actually makes them move faster and consume pathogens more aggressively. It is biologically optimal.
That's incredible.
The Seattle Children's Hospital even has a section on its website specifically designed to talk parents off the ledge when their kid gets warm.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they explicitly state, and I quote, "Fevers turn on the body's immune system. Normal fevers between 100 and 104 degrees Fahrenheit are good for sick children."
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting to me, because you just laid out the undeniable, scientifically proven, mathematically optimal reality, right? Fevers are an evolutionary superpower. They are the rational biological response to keep you alive. That is the objective truth.
Yes, the data is totally unambiguous on this.
But the twist here is what actually happens in the real world. Like in your house, tonight. Despite millions of years of evolution, despite the NIH data, despite the Seattle Children's Hospital practically begging us to let it happen, parents, patients, doctors, and especially multi-billion-dollar drug companies almost universally treat fevers as a terrible, dangerous misfortune that must be eliminated immediately.
Oh, without hesitation. The source actually quotes a study that puts it very bluntly. It says, the treatment of fever in the ICU setting is likely related to standard dogma rather than evidence-based practice.
In the ICU.
Right. Think about that. Even in an intensive care unit, the most data-driven, highly monitored environment on Earth, we are actively fighting our own biology because of cultural habits.
That is wild.
Howard DeMarco, he's a medical historian, he calls it fever phobia, and says this phobia spreads just as widely as the infectious diseases themselves.
So what does this all mean for us? If you're listening to this right now, think about the last time you or your kid had a 100-degree fever. You probably didn't, celebrate your hyperactivated T cells.
Definitely not.
You probably reached straight for the medicine cabinet. If the science is so completely obvious, why do we actively ignore it? Why do we pop Tylenol the second the thermometer hits 99.5?
The author of our source document distills it down to its most basic, unavoidable human element. He says, I don't think it's complicated. Fevers hurt, and people don't want to hurt.
It's so profound, isn't it? It makes me think of an analogy.
Well, let's hear it.
Imagine knowing that a brutal, high-intensity, muscle-tearing workout is scientifically the absolute best thing for your long-term cardiovascular health and longevity. It is the rational choice.
Right.
But the day after the workout, your muscles are just screaming. It hurts to walk up the stairs. It hurts to sit down. So instead of letting your body recover and build the strength that you initiated the workout for in the first place, you pay a doctor to perform a procedure to make the muscle soreness disappear immediately.
Even if that procedure completely negates the benefit of the workout.
Exactly. We prioritize immediate comfort over optimal long-term biology because, simply put, pain hurts.
That's a perfect way to frame it. When you are shivering under a blanket, sweating, feeling like your joints are made of ground glass, you do not care about a double-blind NIH study detailing viral replication rates.
No, you don't.
You don't care about a factor of 200. You just want the suffering to stop immediately.
Yeah.
And this leads to a crucial insight from the text, which is really the bridge to everything else we're going to discuss today. The author says, a doctor's goal is not just to cure disease. It's to cure disease within the confines of what's reasonable and tolerable to the patient.
Within the confines of what's reasonable and tolerable. That is the golden phrase.
It really is.
Because the scientifically optimal cure is totally useless if the patient refuses to endure the treatment. I mean, it might be mathematically rational to want a 103-degree fever to clear an infection in 3 days instead of 5, but it is entirely unreasonable to expect a human being to just sit there and cheerfully suffer when a Tylenol is sitting right there, offering immediate relief.
Exactly. And if we connect this biological reality to the bigger picture, this deeply ingrained evolutionary desire to avoid physical pain is the exact same mechanism that drives us to avoid emotional pain when managing our money, building our careers, and planning our lives.
Which means we need to look at what happens when we take that exact same human brain, which is so terrified of pain, and drop it into the high-stakes world of modern finance.
A very dangerous place for that brain to be.
Let's move from the physical pain of a fever to the psychological pain of financial regret. Because we have another Nobel laureate to talk about, but this time he's not a medical doctor, he's a mathematician.
We're talking about Harry Markowitz.
Yes.
And to understand the weight of this story, you have to understand who Markowitz is to the financial world. He is a titan of academic finance.
Like Mount Rushmore level?
Truly. He won the Nobel Prize in economics for his foundational work in exploring the mathematical, highly complex trade-off between risk and return. He practically invented the modern understanding of how to build an optimal portfolio on paper.
Okay, can you explain that for the listener who might not have an MBA? What did he actually figure out?
Yeah, so before Markowitz, investing was largely just picking stocks you thought would go up. It was essentially guessing.
Just trying to pick winners.
Right. But Markowitz introduced something called modern portfolio theory in the 1950s. He used intense mathematical variance and covariance equations to prove that you could build an efficient frontier.
An efficient frontier.
Basically, he proved that by combining assets that don't move in the same direction at the same time, like stocks and bonds, you could scientifically engineer a portfolio that extracts the absolute maximum expected return for a highly specific, defined level of risk.
So he literally wrote the math on how to perfectly optimize your money. He is the ultimate spreadsheet guy.
He is the architect of the spreadsheet. His models are incredibly dense, mathematically rigorous frameworks. It is the absolute epitome of cold, calculating rationality.
Okay, so you have this absolute genius in the 1950s inventing the math of modern investing. And someone eventually asks him the most obvious question in the world, right? Hey, Harry, how did you invest your own retirement money while you were developing these groundbreaking, world-changing models?
And his answer is just astonishing.
It's hilarious.
He didn't use his complex models. He didn't calculate his covariance or map his efficient frontier. He admitted he just split his retirement contributions straight down the middle, 50% into bonds and 50% into equities. A 50-50 split.
The most basic, unnuanced, structurally simple allocation possible.
A child could have come up with it.
Hold on. I have to jump in here because if I'm the learner listening to this, I'm practically screaming at my dashboard right now. Markowitz is a Nobel-winning mathematician. If I hired an architect to build me a structurally sound house and he handed me a brilliant blueprint, but then they found out he lived in a mud hut because his own blueprints made him sad, I'd fire him. How does the academic world not view this as absolute cowardice? Isn't he basically admitting his own math is useless for real people?
That is the exact tension that makes it so fascinating, and it is the standard critique from pure academics. The academic world often does view emotion as a bug in the system, a weakness to be eradicated. They would say Markowitz failed his own test.
Right.
But the reasoning Markowitz gave for abandoning his life's work when it came to his own wallet is the core of our discussion today. Markowitz said, and I quote, "I visualized my grief if the stock market went way up and I wasn't in it, or if it went way down and I was completely in it. My intention was to minimize my future regret."
Minimize my future regret, not maximize my mathematical return, not optimize my risk-adjusted alpha. He actively chose to minimize his grief.
Exactly. And what the source material argues is that Markowitz wasn't being a coward. He was being profoundly self-aware. This highlights the massive glaring gap between a rational investor and a reasonable investor.
Okay, unpack that difference for me.
A rational investor, on paper, makes decisions based purely on numeric facts, historical data, and standard deviations.
Yeah.
They assume that if the math says hold, you hold.
Because the spreadsheet doesn't have a nervous system.
Right. He doesn't get scared.
Yeah.
But a reasonable investor, a real human being, makes decisions in a conference room. They make decisions surrounded by coworkers whose opinions they care about.
Yeah.
They go home to a spouse they desperately don't want to let down, or terrify with bad news. They compare themselves to their neighbor who just bought a new boat, or their incredibly annoying brother-in-law who always brags about his tech stock picks at Thanksgiving.
Oh, we all have that brother-in-law.
And most importantly, they make decisions plagued by their own internal biological fear of the unknown.
So the source notes that investing has this massive social and emotional component that is almost completely ignored when you look at it through a strictly financial or academic lens.
Yes, we forget that money isn't just numbers on a screen. It's status, it's physical security, it's ego. It's literally a proxy for survival.
It's so true.
The financial journalist Jason Zweig actually conducted the interview where Markowitz confessed his 50-50 split. And Zweig later reflected on it, saying something really profound. My own view is that people are neither rational nor irrational. We are human, we don't like to think harder than we need to, and we have unceasing demands on our attention.
So Zweig is essentially arguing that acknowledging your emotions isn't a failure of discipline, it's a requirement for survival.
Precisely. Zweig went on to say that there is nothing surprising about the fact that the pioneer of modern portfolio theory built his own portfolio with so little regard for his own research. Markowitz understood a fundamental truth about himself. If he used the mathematically perfect portfolio, but it caused him so much daily anxiety that he eventually panicked and sold everything at the bottom of a market crash, then the perfect math would result in real-world ruin.
Oh, wow. Okay, that clicks perfectly with the fever analogy. The 103-degree fever is the mathematically perfect portfolio. It is scientifically proven to be the fastest way to kill the virus, or in finance, the fastest way to compound wealth. But if the fever makes the patient so miserable that they jump out of a window to escape the pain, the cure killed the patient. Markovitz wasn't abandoning his math. He was engineering a portfolio that he could actually stomach living with. He was factoring his own biological limits into the equation.
He was optimizing for endurance, not just mathematics. If a strategy looks perfect on a spreadsheet but causes you to lose sleep, fight with your spouse, and eventually abandon the strategy entirely at the worst possible moment, it is a flawed strategy for you.
Which is an incredible setup for the next question. Because if even a Nobel laureate, the guy who literally wrote the equations for risk, can't stomach pure mathematical rationality with his own money, what on earth happens when academics who don't have that self-awareness try to force pure, unadulterated math onto normal, everyday people?
You get absolute disaster. Or, as the source brilliantly calls it, you get advice that is technically true but contextually nonsense.
Technically true, but contextually nonsense. That is the perfect description of what happens when spreadsheets collide with reality. And to illustrate this, the source brings up a specific academic study that just blew my mind because it is so fundamentally divorced from human psychology.
Oh, yeah. We were talking about the Yale leverage study.
Yes, so the listener needs to hear the setup for this because it sounds great on paper. In 2008, a pair of highly respected researchers from Yale published a paper arguing that young savers people in their 20s and early 30s should supercharge their retirement accounts using a 2-to-1 margin.
Let's explain what that actually means mechanically, because margin is a word thrown around a lot. Using a 2-to-1 margin means you are investing with borrowed money. For every $1 of your own money you put into the stock market, you borrow $2 of debt from your brokerage to buy more stocks. You are heavily, aggressively leveraged.
So if I have $10,000 of my own money, I borrow $20,000 from the broker, and I now have $30,000 working for me in the market.
Exactly. You are multiplying your exposure. And you are multiplying both your potential gains and your potential losses. The Yale researchers suggested that investors should use this massive leverage when they are young and then slowly taper it off, deleveraging as they age and get closer to retirement.
And what was their logic for taking on that much massive risk early on?
The mathematical logic is that a young person has decades of human capital earning potential ahead of them. Their most valuable asset isn't their current bank account. It's the 40 years of paychecks they haven't earned yet.
Right, they have time to recover.
Therefore, they can theoretically handle a magnified market roller coaster in their early years because they have the time to absorb the volatility and benefit from the magnified compounding.
Okay, but here is the catch, and the math here is brutal. If you use 2-to-1 margin, a 50% drop in the stock market doesn't just cut your portfolio in half, it completely wipes you out. Let's go back to my $10,000 example. I have $10K of my money, $20K of borrowed money. My total account is $30K. The market drops 50%. My account value drops to $15,000. But I still owe the broker that $20,000 I borrowed.
Right, and the broker isn't going to let you default. They issue a margin call. They automatically sell off your remaining assets to cover as much of their loan as possible. Your $10,000 of personal savings is entirely gone, and you actually still owe them $5,000. It's a total 100% loss of your life savings up to that point, plus debt.
It is absolute devastation. But the Yale researchers ran the models anyway. They used what are called Monte Carlo simulations, right?
For the listener, a Monte Carlo simulation is a way to test a financial strategy by having a computer roll the dice millions of times, simulating thousands of parallel universes of market returns, including the worst crashes in history. They tested this leverage strategy against every conceivable disaster scenario.
And they found something incredible. The researchers proved mathematically that even if a young investor got completely wiped out by a 50% market crash early in their career, they would still end up with 90% higher expected retirement wealth in the long run compared to people who just played it safe in standard non-leveraged life cycle funds.
And we have to be absolutely clear here. The math works. On paper, across millions of Monte Carlo simulations, it is a completely rational, mathematically sound strategy. The expected value at age 65 is objectively higher.
But there is a massive, gaping, fatal flaw in this study, and it all hinges on one little assumption the researchers made about how a human being acts after a disaster. What is the caveat for this math to actually result in 90% more wealth?
The caveat, the absolute requirement for that outperformance to exist is that after the young investor watches 100% of their retirement account evaporate into thin air and gets a margin call from their broker, they must pick themselves back up, follow the plan, and keep saving in a 2-to-1 leveraged account the very next day.
Which is completely insane.
It is the definition of absurdly unreasonable. It assumes the investor feels absolutely nothing.
Think about what that actually means for the learner listening right now. Imagine logging into your Vanguard account, seeing your entire net worth drop to literal zero, and then calmly saying, well, the Yale Monte Carlo simulations say my expected value at age 65 is still positive, and then going right back to the bank to borrow more money on margin to do it again.
Right.
No normal human being on planet Earth could do that. They would be absolutely traumatized. They would quit investing forever. They would stuff their cash in a coffee can in the backyard. Or, as the author points out, they would probably sue their financial advisor for malpractice.
This is exactly what we mean by contextually nonsense. It is a textbook example of researchers treating human beings like spreadsheets. The strategy assumes a level of emotional detachment that simply does not exist in the mammalian brain.
We're not built for it.
We are wired to remember pain, so we avoid it in the future. Experiencing a total financial wipeout is deeply traumatic. The expected wealth might be 90% higher on the chalkboard, but as the source concludes, the strategy is 100% less reasonable.
I was trying to think of an analogy for this, because it's not just about math being wrong, it's about math ignoring psychology. It's like engineers designing a bridge over a massive canyon. The engineers use flawless physics to design a bridge that can mathematically hold 10,000 tons of weight. On paper, it is the most efficient, cost-effective, strongest bridge ever designed. But to make it that efficient, they designed it without guardrails, and they designed it to sway violently in the wind. The math is flawless. The bridge will never collapse.
But human beings are so deeply terrified by the violent swaying and the lack of guardrails that they abandon their cars and refuse to cross it.
Exactly. A bridge that nobody is willing to drive across is a failed bridge, no matter what the structural integrity calculations say. A financial strategy that terrifies you into quitting is a failed strategy, no matter what the Monte Carlo simulations say.
That analogy perfectly captures the danger. If pure, emotionless rationality leads to panic, trauma, and ultimately quitting the game entirely, then rationality is actually your biggest liability, which means we need to completely flip the script.
How do we do that?
If a mathematically perfect strategy fails because it lacks emotional guardrails, then we need to look at how we can use our emotions as those guardrails. We need to use emotion as an asset.
Which brings us to the next massive pivot in our source material. We are shifting from how emotion causes us to fail to how embracing our emotional attachments might actually be the superpower we need to survive. And the text introduces a piece of advice that is highly provocative in traditional finance circles. The author states plainly, let me suggest that you love your investments.
Love your investment. That completely flies in the face of everything you hear on financial news networks.
It really does. If you turn on CNBC, the standard advice is exactly the opposite. It's almost a badge of honor for serious investors to claim they're completely emotionless. Don't fall in love with a stock, they say. It's just a ticker symbol. Leave your emotions at the door. Be ruthless.
Because being ruthless and emotionless sounds rational. It sounds professional, like a surgeon operating on a patient. But the author argues that this is fundamentally misguided for a long-term investor. If lacking emotion makes it easier for you to walk away from a perfectly good strategy the second it underperforms, then your rational detachment is actually a fatal flaw.
Why is walking away so dangerous? I mean, if a stock or a strategy is losing money, shouldn't a rational person cut their losses and move on?
Not necessarily, and this is where the historical data becomes crucial to understand. To grasp why endurance matters more than anything else in building wealth, we have to look at the historical odds of making money in the U.S. stock market. The text lays out these probabilities clearly, and they are eye-opening. If you invest in the broad U.S. market for just a one-day period, your odds of making money are basically a coin flip, 50-50.
It's pure gambling. You might as well go to Vegas and put it on black.
Exactly. The day-to-day movements are noise. Now, if you extend that time horizon and hold your investment for a one-year period, your odds of historical success improve to 68%.
Okay, 68% is better. But that still means you have nearly a 1 in 3 chance of losing money over an entire 12 months. That's a long time to stare at a red number on your screen and feel stupid.
It is a long time. But watch what happens as you endure. If you hold for a 10-year period, your historical odds of success jump to 88%. And if you can manage to stay invested for a 20-year period, historically, the odds of making money in the U.S. market jump to 100%. At least so far in U.S. market history, there has never been a 20-year period where the broad market lost money.
So, the single greatest variable dictating whether you succeed or fail isn't how smart you are, or what complex models you use, or whether you perfectly predicted the next tech trend. It's simply whether you can stay in your seat for 2 decades.
What's fascinating here is how the author connects these dots to completely redefine what an advantage is in finance. If endurance is the most important variable, if reaching year 20 is the only thing that guarantees success, then anything that keeps you in the game during the inevitable painful years has a highly quantifiable mathematical advantage.
And there will absolutely be painful years. You will have years where your portfolio is down 20%, 30%. You will look at your life savings and feel a physical pit in your stomach, just like the fever.
And if you are completely emotionless about your strategy, what is keeping you there when the pain hits? If you view a stock as just a ticker symbol, just a line of code on a spreadsheet, and that ticker symbol is currently causing you severe financial and psychological pain, the most logical, frictionless action is to sell it and move on to something that feels better.
The path of least resistance is to bail. There is no anchor holding you to the ship.
Precisely. You will abandon the strategy long before you reach the 20-year finish line. But what happens if you actually love the company? What if you are deeply passionate about the mission, the product they make, the management team, or the groundbreaking science they are developing?
Then it changes the dynamic completely. If you love the company, the downtimes are blunted. You aren't just losing money on a spreadsheet. You feel like you are standing by a team you believe in during a tough quarter. You feel like you are part of something meaningful.
That emotional connection, that passion, creates psychological friction. It acts as an anchor. It slows down your finger when it hovers over the sell button. It acts as the necessary motivation that prevents you from giving up and moving on when the math temporarily turns against you.
So when people say do what you love or invest in what you believe in, it usually sounds like empty, fluffy fortune cookie advice. But you're saying it's actually a calculated, hardened survival mechanism.
Exactly. If you view do what you love merely as a guide to being happy, it is fluffy. But if you view it as the required fuel to provide the endurance necessary to capture those 20-year, 100% historical odds of success, then suddenly loving your investments isn't a fluffy afterthought. It is the structural load-bearing pillar of your entire financial strategy.
It's the only way you survive the winter. You need the emotional fire to stay warm when the market freezes over. The rational investor who feels nothing abandons their perfectly optimized portfolio during the crash of 2008, locking in their losses. The reasonable investor who loves their technically imperfect portfolio holds on because they believe in the companies and they ride the recovery to wealth.
The reasonable investor who loves their strategy has a massive edge over the rational investor who abandons their strategy at the first sign of trouble.
This is such a paradigm shift. And it turns out loving an investment isn't the only technically irrational thing we do that actually saves us from ourselves. The text actually lays out a whole list of behaviors that look incredibly stupid on paper, but make total sense for a human life. Let's explore some of these in what we could call the Reasonable Hall of Fame.
I love that. These are everyday financial behaviors that perfectly highlight the beauty and necessity of embracing our contradictions. The first one the author brings up is a very well-documented, widespread phenomenon called home bias.
Right. Home bias is when an investor heavily prefers to invest their money in companies located within their own country, while largely ignoring the rest of the globe. From a purely rational diversification standpoint, this makes zero sense. If you live in the U.S., you are ignoring 95% of the planet's population and a massive chunk of global innovation. If you live in the UK or Australia, it's even more extreme.
A purely rational spreadsheet would tell you to perfectly allocate your capital across emerging markets, European equities, Asian tech sectors, proportional to their global GDP weight. Concentrating your wealth in one single country's economy is mathematically riskier. But the text asks us to reconsider what investing actually is at its psychological core.
Which is terrifying.
It is. Investing is, fundamentally, handing the money you traded your precious life energy for over to complete strangers, trusting that they won't steal it, and hoping they will give you more back in the future.
You are giving your survival resources to people you have never met.
It requires a massive leap of faith. And if seeing a company's logo on your drive to work, or understanding the cultural context of a domestic brand, or simply knowing that the company operates under the same legal system as you do, provides the familiarity you need to feel comfortable taking that leap of faith, then home bias is profoundly reasonable.
So it's not just a preference, it's a psychological safety blanket. The familiarity bridges the trust gap. It is better to invest with a mathematically imperfect home bias than to be so terrified of the complexity of foreign markets that you don't invest at all.
Exactly. The imperfect action you take is infinitely better than the perfect action you are too paralyzed to take.
Okay, the next one in the Hall of Fame is the day trading itch. And the author brings up a real-world example, Josh Brown, who is a very prominent financial advisor, author, and commentator.
Yes. Josh Brown is a fierce, vocal advocate for owning boring, highly diversified, low-cost index funds. That is the core of his professional advice to clients, and it is the core of his personal wealth. He knows the data shows that trying to pick individual stocks to beat the market is a fool's errand for almost everyone. However, he openly admits that he also owns a smattering of individual stocks.
Which seems incredibly hypocritical. Why buy individual stocks when your entire professional brand is built on the fact that stock picking is a loser's game? The odds are heavily stacked against you generating alpha or outperforming the baseline market.
The author explains that Brown isn't doing it because he harbors some delusion that he is going to generate massive alpha. Brown's justification is beautifully simple and deeply human. He says, I just love stocks and have ever since I was 20 years old, and it's my money, I get to do whatever.
I love that. It's my money, I get to do whatever. It's so honest.
It is the perfect defense because it acknowledges his own humanity. But structurally, what is happening here is brilliant. A small amount of irrational day trading or stock picking acts as a psychological pressure release valve. Humans have a natural urge to tinker, to gamble, to feel smart, to participate in the narrative of the market. If Josh Brown completely suppressed that urge in the name of pure indexed rationality, that pressure would build up until he eventually snapped and messed around with his core retirement funds.
It's quarantine. He's quarantining the irrational urge in a safe, low-stakes environment so it doesn't infect the main portfolio. Let me try an analogy here to see if this tracks. It feels exactly like scheduling a cheat meal when you're on a very strict diet. The diet is the rational, mathematically optimal spreadsheet. Count your macros, weigh your proteins, eat boiled chicken and broccoli. But no human being wants to eat boiled chicken every day for the rest of their life, so you schedule a cheat meal on Sunday. Now, eating a giant plate of nachos is not mathematically helping you lose weight. It is, strictly speaking, a failure of the diet's math. It adds empty calories.
Right. From a purely metabolic standpoint, the cheat meal is detrimental.
But the psychological relief that the cheat meal provides, the fact that you have something to look forward to, is the only reason you don't completely snap and abandon the diet entirely by week 3. The irrational cheat meal is the structural support system that prevents the systemic collapse of the rational diet.
That is a phenomenal analogy. Building consistency in any endeavor requires acknowledging and accommodating our own inconsistencies. You build the cheat meal into the system so the system doesn't break. Josh Brown builds a small stock-picking account into his financial life so that his serious, life-sustaining, diversified investments remain completely untouched. He manages the pressure by letting a little steam out.
That makes total sense. Okay, what about economic forecasts? Because I feel like every time I turn on the TV, someone in a very expensive suit is predicting exactly where the S&P 500 will be in 6 months, or exactly when the next recession will hit, or what the Federal Reserve will do next Tuesday.
And as the text points out, most of those forecasts are absolutely terrible. The track record of experts predicting the economy is abysmal. They are consistently wrong. Acting on those investment forecasts, rearranging your portfolio based on a prediction of what the market will do next year, is deeply dangerous and mathematically irrational.
So why do we keep making them, and why do we keep watching them? If they are statistically useless, why does this entire multi-billion-dollar industry of financial forecasting exist?
Because while making forecasts is statistically irrational, it is psychologically reasonable. It is fundamentally human nature to try to predict the future. We are narrative creatures. The author observes that it is incredibly hard to wake up in the morning, look at your family, look at your savings, and accept the absolute undeniable truth that you have no clue what tomorrow holds. The sheer unpredictability of life is terrifying.
We crave narrative. We crave control over our environment.
Exactly. Even if a forecast is ultimately proven wrong, the act of forecasting and the act of consuming a forecast provides an illusion of control in the present moment.
Yeah.
It creates a narrative that allows us to function, make plans, and get out of bed. We can't live in a state of constant paralyzing uncertainty. So reading a forecast is a reasonable coping mechanism for dealing with an unknowable future, as long as you recognize it as a coping mechanism and don't bet your life savings on it.
We need the illusion of a map, even if the map is drawn in crayon. It gives us the courage to start walking. Okay, the final inductee into the Reasonable Hall of Fame is perhaps the most ironic of all. We have to talk about Jack Bogle.
The late, great Jack Bogle. He is a legend in the finance world. He was the founder of Vanguard, and he spent his entire life on a relentless, incredibly successful crusade promoting low-cost passive index investing. He is the guy who popularized the idea that you shouldn't try to beat the market. You should just buy the whole market for as little cost as possible. He proved with mountains of data that high-fee, actively managed mutual funds almost always underperform the market over time because the fees eat up the returns.
He famously said that high-fee funds violate the humble rules of arithmetic. He was the ultimate champion of the mathematical truth that keeping your costs near zero is the primary key to long-term wealth.
And yet,
the ultimate irony, Jack Bogle's son grew up to become an active, high-fee hedge fund and mutual fund manager. And what did Jack Bogle, the crusader against high fees, do with some of his own personal money? He invested it in his son's high-fee fund.
He deliberately chose to pay high fees for active management, completely contradicting his own life's work and the very foundation of the company he built.
When he was asked by the Wall Street Journal to explain this glaring, almost comical hypocrisy, his answer was just perfect. He didn't try to defend the math. He said, "We do some things for family reasons. If it's not consistent, well, life isn't always consistent."
Life isn't always consistent. It is the mic drop of reasonable behavior. He recognized that the humble rules of arithmetic are powerful, but they are absolutely powerless against the love a father has for his son. It would have been mathematically rational to refuse to invest in his son's fund. He could have told his son, "Sorry, you violate the humble rules of arithmetic." But it would have been cold, heartless, and ultimately unreasonable.
It shows that at the end of the day, money is a tool to serve our lives, not the other way around. If being perfectly rational makes you a terrible father, then rationality has failed you.
Exactly. Bogle prioritized his relationship over his expense ratio, which is the most deeply human thing you can do.
Wow. We have covered a massive amount of ground today. Let's try to synthesize this journey as we move into our final thoughts. We started with a 19th century doctor intentionally giving people malaria, which showed us that what is biologically and mathematically optimal, like a fever fighting a virus, is often completely ignored if it causes us too much pain in the present moment. We treat the fever with Tylenol because we just want the shivering to stop, prioritizing immediate comfort over long-term efficiency.
And we saw that exact same biological avoidance of pain translate seamlessly into the financial world. Harry Markowitz, the genius who wrote the equations for risk, splitting his Nobel Prize-winning investments 50-50 just to avoid the pain of future regret, he knew the perfect math would cause him too much anxiety.
We saw the Yale study prove that a mathematically perfect 2-to-1 margin is worse than useless if it requires a human being to endure the trauma of losing everything and carry on without emotion. A bridge that is perfectly engineered but terrifies people from crossing it is a failed bridge. It's technically true, but contextually nonsense.
And finally, we saw how embracing our so-called flaws, loving a company to prevent ourselves from selling during a crash, exhibiting home bias to bridge the trust gap, scratching the day trading itch to quarantine our gambling urges, or supporting family despite the mathematical cost, are all actually vital survival mechanisms. They are rejections of cold mathematical optimization in favor of strategies that let us sleep at night and, most importantly, keep us in the game for the 2 decades required to guarantee success.
Which brings us directly to you, the learner. Whether you are prepping for a boardroom presentation where you need to present a new corporate strategy to your team, or you are diving into a new field of research, or you are just sitting at your kitchen table tonight trying to figure out how to manage your own savings, you have to factor in your own humanity. You have to factor in the humanity of the people you work with.
If you build a perfect rational system, whether it's a corporate workflow, a new diet and exercise routine, or a retirement portfolio that a normal, emotional person cannot actually stick to when they are tired, scared, or stressed, that system is useless.
Oh.
Aim to be reasonable. Accommodate your need for comfort, your fear of regret, and your need for social validation. Building a system you can endure is vastly superior to building a perfect system you will abandon.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on this core idea of endurance. The source text we explored today definitively proves that endurance is the ultimate advantage in finance. The longer you stay in the game, the closer your odds of success approach 100%. But take a look at the rest of your life. Step outside of your portfolio for a second. Consider the habits you've tried to build, the diets you've started, the creative projects, the side hustles, or the business ideas you've historically failed at or abandoned halfway through.
It's a powerful question to ask yourself.
What if they didn't fail because you lacked willpower? What if they didn't fail because you weren't smart enough or because you didn't have the right data? What if they failed because you engineered the process to be so coldly efficient, so perfectly rational, that your very human, very emotional brain actively rebelled against it? Maybe the secret to your next great success isn't finding a better spreadsheet, a more optimal algorithm, or a stricter set of rules. Maybe the secret is simply allowing yourself to be a little more human.
We are not spreadsheets. We are flawed, emotional people, and if we plan for that, it might just be our greatest asset.
Beautifully said. Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time.